Well, now that we've gotten ourselves settled down and moving off the big green egg.
Okay, we'll pay attention.
Yeah, but it just sense the aroma in the studio. Let's talk about another hot thing, hotter than barbecues, and that would be the hot topics that sometimes are taking place in Christianity. We've talked about several hot topics, ranking sin.
Yeah.
Another hot topic that I wanted to talk to you about is judging others. Very quick to make that happen in your life and mine.
Yeah.
People, we can do that.
I think Christians have a problem with judging outsiders, John. And I see this all the time on social media. I hear it in the wider church. We've worked really hard to preserve, not make this a value of our church. But we're pretty good at criticizing the world for being the world. And we're pretty good at criticizing non-Christians for being non-Christians. And I think often, the Bible says, Paul was very clear. He said, you are not to judge outsiders. And sometimes inside the church, we just react with shock and horror when people who don't know Jesus act like people who don't know Jesus.
And have no biblical worldview, acting like people who have no biblical worldview.
Exactly. And by the same token, I think we also excuse our own sins, and we talked about that on a previous show, but the Bible actually says, Paul says, you should judge those inside the church, but not those outside the church. And often we'll let each other off the hook. I'm not going to attack you for your envy or your greed or your jealousy or your divisiveness, but I'm sure going to attack my neighbor who is jealous or smokes weed or drinks too much or parties all weekend, and I just don't understand why that is, and so that bothers me.
Especially whenever the overarching rule of our lives should be love. Love people, love our neighbors, love God, love others.
Well, nobody has ever been judged into life change. Nobody's ever like, oh, I was so judged, I'm going to surrender my life to Christ. But a lot of people have been loved into life change.
Yeah.
And I think if we come to a place where I'll confess my sin, and I better confess my sin, and I'll take my sin seriously, and I'll love my neighbor, I think we'd be stronger in the church.
You, as we've talked in off camera and on camera a little bit, but let's talk a little more on camera. It concerns you about how much openness and expression unfiltered stuff is taking place on social media these days with Christians.
Well, it is our witness to the world. I trust that most of the people who have a social media profile have lots of non-Christian friends like I do. And when you fill up your news feed and you fill up your social media with lots of angry condemnations of the world, just remember that there are people who don't know Jesus who are reading and watching. And I would be very careful about what I say. Be authentic, be true. But be careful because the world's watching.
Should we use filters, things like faith, hope, and love? Say, okay, if it isn't of faith, if it isn't of hope, if it isn't of love, maybe we shouldn't be out there talking about these things in such negative tones?
I use a filter. I can't trace it back to a verse, but my filter is helpful. If it's not helpful, don't share it.
Yeah.
If you're not going to build somebody up, I guess you could take that back to Ephesians, right? Build each other up in love.
Yeah.
But if it's not going to build somebody up, I don't post it. And so sometimes even when I struggle or I fall or I make a mistake or I have a goof, it's like, well, maybe that's just interesting to somebody, or maybe that's, it lets them know that they're not alone, rather than trying to slam somebody on social media.
Carey, how can people find out about you on social media or through your blog?
Well, I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook as C. Nieuwhof. I'm also on Periscope, if there's any Periscopers out there. That just links to a Twitter account. And then my blog is simply CareyNieuwhof.com, and you can get even to my leadership podcast off that blog.
Yeah, people are really paying attention to things that Carey is saying on his blog. It's well read and extremely respected, and he's talking to a lot of influencers every single week. Thanks, buddy.
Hey,
good
thanks,
stuff.
John.